From early dreams of being a football player to becoming the most feared athlete in the history of women's MMA, here's why fighters are really scared of Amanda Nunes. Born outside of Salvador, Brazil, Nunes' earliest dreams were of playing professional football, a dream she hoped would eventually take her on a road of real stability and wealth. Well, she was right about at least some part of that. When Nunes first started martial arts, she was just 5 years old. Her first fighting system was capoeira, which started aged 7. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu came to Amanda at 16, and after carving out success on the sports circuit, she transitioned to MMA, which seemed like the logical next step. It was clear from the get-go that Nunes had a natural aptitude. After a string of finishes in Brazil, she got noticed. She was signed to fight in the US, but her road to the UFC had only just begun. She started in Strikeforce, then moved to Invicta, and in 2013, her call to the big octagon finally arrived, and to say she answered it would be the understatement of the century. But she wasn't always seen as the future champion of the division. No, Nunes kinda just burst onto the scene with a number of standout victories.
She's walking Ronda down. She tags her again. Over and over. Amanda Nunes.
And she came into a lot of big fights as an underdog. After losing to Kat Zingano by way of a brutal finish, Nunes spent her next few fights getting very little attention. And when she did finally fight the big names in her weight class, she was always very clearly the B-side. Valentina Shevchenko, Miesha Tate, and Ronda Rousey. All these fighters were getting the majority of the attention from the fans. And Nunes went in there and beat them all. With each passing appearance, Nunes started to build her reputation, until it became very clear sometime around the Chris Cyborg fight that this was the most dangerous woman on the planet. These days, fighters don't make the mistake of underestimating her, and if you want to know why she's so feared, just pay attention to her resume. She KO'd the first ever Bellator women's featherweight, Julia Budd, in 14 seconds, KO'd the future UFC champ Germaine de Randamie in the first round, and then beat her again in the rematch. She beat the brakes off Miesha Tate and submitted her in just over 3 minutes. She embarrassed Ronda Rousey in just 48 seconds, and it was one of the most one-sided fights in UFC history. She holds 2 wins over her biggest rival for GOAT status, Valentina Shevchenko, and her other biggest rival, Chris Cyborg. Well, Nunes moved up in weight and KO'd her in 51 seconds. When she took on the greatest head kicker in the division, Holly Holm, she gave her a taste of her own medicine, knocking her out with a first-round head kick. It's a record that doesn't even sound real. Nunes isn't some technical marvel who beats all her opponents by outclassing them. That is true to some extent, but she's a mean, brutal, and unforgiving knockout artist at her core, and she has the record to show for it. Wouldn't you be scared too? Her contenders would never admit it, but there was no way they weren't intimidated by the amount of icons she was destroying. The words legend killer are thrown around quite a lot in combat sports, but she's finishing MMA champions consistently, and most of the time, she's doing it in the first round. That's a level of effectiveness that's not normal. When you sign on the dotted line to take on the Lioness, eventually, the truth is going to set in. You don't get a record like that by accident, folks.
I thought she still won the fight. Oh, nice slip there, but nice.
Nunes' KO ability is not natural, but let's make one thing clear. Amanda is not only a striker. No, her high-level BJJ background was actually front and center during her early years. In fact, it was kind of strange watching how great a striker she eventually became, because her powerful wrestling and grappling were a lot more pronounced back then. But these days, Nunes can still dip into her old bag of tricks whenever needed. Her battles with Megan Anderson, and Germaine de Randamie in particular, showcase just how much of a beast Nunes is on the ground. She scored a triangle armbar against Anderson, and when she finally met her match in the striking department against GDR, her wrestling and BJJ mastery got her the dominant win. Most of these women have no idea what they're in for when they take on the Lioness. Holding a belt in any division is an incredibly tough thing to do, but when you rise up and pretty much end the GOAT conversation in the sport, you're going to have something very different in your arsenal. Beyond any kick, punch, elbow, or knee thrown inside the cage, Nunes' greatest strength is perhaps her immense confidence. She already knows she can beat the greatest fighters in the world because her track record against her so-called biggest threats contains many fights that were not competitive, not even slightly. What must that do to an opponent's confidence? When they look at Nunes' records, all those KOs, all those big names, and none of them ever troubled her more than bringing it to a close decision. And the one fighter who did, Juliana Pena, got absolutely destroyed destroyed in the rematch. And while it would be unfair to call her win a fluke, it was very clear that Nunes had an off night. The champ doesn't back down from challenges either. She took on Chris Cyborg when others were making up excuses not to fight her. Jermaine de Randamie gave up her belt so she wouldn't have to get in there with her. Nunes decided to take the fight, and she moved up in weight and destroyed a 10-year-long unbeaten streak in less than a minute. Not only is Nunes the pound-for-pound GOAT, but she's also actively putting in that reputation into practice, defending her 2 titles frequently. She's been a double champ way longer than anyone else. In fact, she's moving into her 5th year as a 2-weight world champ. And, well, sure, the 145-pound division barely exists, but Nunes' 2 title defenses in that division still count for a lot. It's just hard to know what her opponents see as an ideal route to victory. She's always going to have the power advantage, and her frame for either weight class allows her to use distance better than any of her adversaries. The big question is, so do you try to avoid the striking? Well, Amanda has a string of high-profile submission victories, so good luck putting your own BJJ to work. And if you want to try and pressure her like Juliana Pena did, well, you're putting yourself in some real danger of getting hit very, very hard. Pena made it work for her once, but it didn't go so well the second time. She's as well-rounded as any fighter to ever do it, experienced as they come over 5 rounds, and in a division where finishes are less common. She is posting insane numbers. Cyborg probably should have had the striking advantage, but that didn't work out for her in the end. Miesha Tate, a proven wrestler, was fresh off the most famous submission outside of Rousey in women's MMA history, and Nunes cut through her defenses like they weren't there, choking her for the tap in the first round. If the stylistic pairing isn't favorable, like when she fought de Randamie, Nunes can mix it up, opting not to strike with the kickboxer in favor of wrestling her. She's intelligent, mature as a champion, and deadly if you give her the opportunity. It's hard to know just how long she has left in the fight game, but her last performance did not show any signs of a fighter slowing down. Sure, we'd love to see another fight between her and Valentina Shevchenko, even if the Bullet just lost her belt, but the real question now is just who can actually challenge Nunes at the top level. It's a tough position to be in as a champion, but she is clearly miles ahead of the competition. Her next fight will see her take on Juliana Pena for a trilogy fight, but in reality, most people agree that we don't need to see that one again. It would be a major shock if Amanda doesn't absolutely steamroll her. However, things can always get crazy in a fight. Let's just see how it plays out. One thing is certain, fighting Amanda Nunes is a tough night out. And if you ask us, her contemporaries have very good reason to be terrified. From her ungodly punching power at 2 different weight classes to her insane finishing statistic, it's pretty easy to see why Amanda Nunes really scares other fighters.